Welcome to Reddit Quests. Reddit, what was your scariest encounter with another person? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Story 1. My cousin, who was like 14, was babysitting us. 9-year-old me, 4-year-old brother. Her dad called coming down from, I want to say crack? Heroin? IDK something real bad. He called and screamed at her to tell him where her piggy bank was. She told him to F off, and hung up. He called back, she didn't pick up, and he left a voice message which played as he was leaving it, saying basically he was gonna come down there and effing end all of us with a knife. He was gonna come down there and effing ill us all. He was full of ish, but we were terrified. Can you imagine the pure fear a 9-year-old feels when a grown man who sounds crazy says he's going to ill her with a knife? So we prepared. We blocked out the windows, locked everything, put heavy furniture in front of the doors. My brother was asleep in his room. My cousin told me just leave him, but I couldn't stand the thought of him being alone in there, so I covert-style belly crawled, heart beating out of my chest, across the kitchen, through the living room to his room, scooped him up, and brought him back to my mom's room, which we then barricaded ourselves into. I got no sleep that night, and my mom and my aunt came back the next morning like, "What the F did you kids do?" But I was honestly just happy to be alive and that my mom was home again. The worst part of the whole thing is when she got home, her dad had sold all of her belongings. I mean everything, her bed, her dresser, TV, it was all gone. It was just an empty room. He's clean now, but I still hate his effing guts. F you, Uncle Donald. Story 2. When I was 15, I regularly was at home by myself since both of my parents worked full-time and my brother had moved away to college. Well, one day during the summer, I was just relaxing at home when all of a sudden someone knocks on the front door. I get up and check the peephole and see 2 guys just standing in the driveway just off the porch. One of them wearing a suit, the other wearing sweatpants and a hoodie, but facing away from the house like he's playing lookout. I decide to ignore them because they'll go away, right? Wrong. They continue knocking, but getting progressively louder and more aggressive. Finally, I decide to call the sheriff's department and ask for a non-emergency check since they're trespassing. My dumbass decides to yell through the door that I had called, and before I can even realize how dumb it is, the guy starts kicking the front door. I freak the F out, run back toward the center of the house and realize that there's a third guy trying to kick in the back door as well. At this point, I call 911 and start screaming about these 3 guys trying to break into my house. Notoriously, it took the sheriff's deputies longer to get there than anyone would imagine, and they see the guys walking down the road later, stop them to question, but no arrest. Story 3. A delivery driver I used to work with pointed a gun at my head as I was bending down to get something from the cooler I was working near. I cracked a joke about him, honestly forget what, and when I stood up I felt it at my temple. He started laughing and I laughed it off too, got him his order ASAP, and when he left I went home and called my boss, and didn't go back till he was fired. Story 4. Yikes. My mom worked the overnight shift at a 7-Eleven through college and once had an attempted robbery go down. It was about 2 in the morning and this guy comes in with his hand in his coat and demands the money from the till. Mom, who is extremely sleep-deprived, thinks he's joking and starts laughing hard, just busting a gut at this. One of those "it's not that funny, but I'm laughing too hard" laughs. Guy starts to bring out a gun. Mom can't stop laughing at this point. Finally, the guy gets freaked out and leaves. It wasn't until minutes later she realized how much trouble she could have been in. He killed himself and his baby's mother a few years after that incident. Story 5. I was driving through a somewhat rough neighborhood at night, late after a movie, and while sitting at a light we saw this guy in a beat-up car take a bump of cocaine next to us. We make eye contact. As the light turns green, he merged behind us and then proceeds to follow us around, flashing his lights and honking his horn for several blocks. We pull up to another red light, he pulls up next to us, yelling at us to roll down the window. Turns out he just wanted to let us know we had a taillight out and then drove away. Story 6. When I was 13, I just got dropped off from the school bus, so I had a bit of ways to walk home. As I get close to the corner of my street, some guy in a dark blue car rolls up and asked where I was headed. Told him I was going home. The guy excruciatingly slowed his car down to match my walk and asked if I wanted to ride home. I told him no thanks, I'm almost home. Then he continued to ask where I live and if I still wanted to ride home. Luckily I had a phone at this age and pulled out my Nokia phone, IDK why I remember this, and pretend to call my mom. She wouldn't have picked up the phone and I was almost home. The guy saw what I was doing and sped off like crazy. From the age of 13, I started carrying pepper spray. Story 7. In 2012, I was just north of Irwin, Tennessee while through hiking the Appalachian Trail in the Roan Mountain area. While at our campsite, maybe 25 yards off a dirt forest trail, a blue F-150 pulls up and a man gets out and says he's an undercover forest ranger. He says there's been a lot of kids causing trouble up around these parts, and did we have any guns or drugs? It was myself and another older gentleman from New Orleans who also said he was through hiking, and two off-duty Coast Guard who were making a weekend hiking trip together. Before that evening, none of us had ever met. We discuss and decide that the guy was fairly creepy and decide to split up and scout out maybe a replacement place to camp. We agree to each hike 15 mins north-south and come back and report if there was a more suitable spot where we were away from the road and the guy would have a harder time finding us. After our little recon trip, we come back and decide there really was nothing all that suitable and decide to just push our tents a little deeper into the woods so as to not be spotted as easily. Around 9 p.m., everyone is in bed and asleep or nearly. 3 gunshots ring out and they're not off in the distance in less than 5 minutes. A truck comes screaming down the path with the high beams on, and the same guy from earlier gets out, brandishing a Glock with an extended magazine. He's hysterical and tells everyone to get out of their tents and on the ground. For the next nearly 45 minutes he kept up the charade that he was an undercover game warden and/or fish and wildlife person. The story would change. After a few minutes into the ordeal, it was fairly obvious he was unstable or on something. That didn't change the fact that he had a gun pointed at us. He would rinse and repeat the same lines over and over. 1. Do you have guns, drugs, or money? 2. You don't have cash? How will you survive out here? 3. I'm just trying to keep you guys safe. 4. There's 4 of you and 1 of me. You're going to try and jump me. Rinse and repeat. This whole cycle would usually last 6, 8 minutes at a time, and nearly the entire 45 minutes we were either laying on our stomachs or on our knees. Fairly early on, the guy from New Orleans jumped up and ran into the woods, found out later with a cell phone, and called the police. They said it would take them about 45 minutes to make it out to the woods and to hold tight. Of course, I didn't know any of this. And more importantly, the guy holding us up lost his mind. Undercover man shouted into the woods and said that if New Orleans didn't come back, the rest of us would be sorry. The guy actually came back. Seriously, he didn't know any of us. And even today, I genuinely don't believe if I was in his shoes, I would walk back into that situation. It's the bravest thing I've ever seen someone do. The situation ended when the man demanded to search our backpacks for the aforementioned drugs, guns, or money. He was kind of easing into stage 3 where he's just trying to keep us safe. He leans down to search my backpack and the 2 Coast Guard guys jump up simultaneously and tackle him. I knocked the gun out of his hand and quickly dropped the mag and discovered that there was a live round in the chamber the whole time. We tied the guy up and waited for the police, who showed up about 20 minutes after. I was incredulous that their response was essentially, "Ooh, that's just crazy, John, he's really done it this time." Or, "Oh, John, they would have been within their rights to shoot you dead." For the record, his name wasn't John, but it was very generic sounding. Here's the best part of the story. There was obviously empty bottles of liquor and a film canister with crushed something in it, and a cell phone with 14 missed calls from his apparent son. While this is being searched, it's explained to me that he was a former minister who got struck by lightning and became a pill popper and kooky ever since. He was known for messing with people, but never to that degree before. I ended up finishing my through hike, but that was without a doubt the scariest thing that happened while I was doing it. Story 8. Late 80s, was running errands in town with my mom and 2 sisters. Back then, it wasn't uncommon to leave your kids in the car while you ran inside the store. We are sitting in the car waiting, and then I see an older guy walking towards our car. I just get a really bad feeling and start yelling at my sisters to lock the doors, while I lock the 2 on my side. He comes over and spends the next couple of minutes trying to open all the doors on the car while we are cowering in our seats. Eventually he gave up and left. We were all 8 and under in age at the time. I just knew that if he got in the car, he would take one of us. Story 9. In our mid-20s, my husband and I lived in a townhome without a yard in a pretty nice area of town. We knew we were purchasing a house soon, so we went ahead and got our first puppy. I'm a morning person whilst my husband is not, so I would usually get up around 5 a.m. and take the puppy out to the little patch of grass across the street from our townhome. Still inside the entire complex, mind you. Did this for several months, no big deal. Well, one morning while out waiting on the puppy, an old Ford van, all beat up with no windows, slowly drives by and goes back behind another building. A few minutes later, as I'm getting ready to cross the street and go back inside, the van comes back up the road to where I was getting ready to cross, stops in the middle of the road and turns off its lights. I waved them on in front of me, and at that point, both doors of the van started to open. All I remember was seeing someone start to get out before both the dog and I felt the undeniable urge to run across the street and inside as fast as possible. Once inside, the van sped off and disappeared. The creepiest part of this whole thing was when I went upstairs to wake my husband only to find out he was in the middle of a dream where I'd been kidnapped. To this day, I refuse to run outside or go on walks alone, even on our quiet country roads, and big old vans still creep me out. Story 10, I was about 14 to 15. School had just ended, so the bus home was packed with other school kids too. We were a couple stops away from where everyone got on when this guy with a huge jacket, hood up and mask on, we were in the middle of a heat wave, so super odd, got on the bus, stormed upstairs past me and my friends, and threw down this huge bag he was carrying. He screamed, "This is a bomb," and ran off the bus. It took everyone a few seconds to process what just happened, but after those few seconds I experienced the craziest panic I've ever seen. Everyone bolted downstairs and tried to get out, but the doors were closed. I remember this huge black dude just punched the glass out of the door like it was nothing and people were just dragging themselves through it. When I got to the door, I hit the emergency release to make it easier to jump off. Once we were out, we sprinted at least 500 m down the road and crouched for the explosion. Except there was no explosion. It was just a hoax. Turns out that the guy that did it was someone from my school that had previously been expelled. TLDR, a kid threw a fake bomb on a bus and terrified everyone. Story 11. Me and my boyfriend came back at like 2 a.m. from a night out. We were both quite drunk and stumbled into the hallway to the elevator when we see drops of something on the floor. It definitely was blood, fresh and wet. The elevator button and door were covered in bloody handprints as well. My boyfriend called the elevator, pushing me aside, not knowing what would be in it. Luckily, nothing except for a puddle of blood. The elevator came from the 5th floor, so we went investigating. The trail of blood ended at a door with huge hand smears of blood on the door. It took all our courage to ring, not the nicest place to live robbery, but I'm so glad we did. An elderly man opened the door. He looked like straight out of a horror movie, covered in blood from head to toe. His gray sweater was red, his hair was wet, his shoes were filled with blood. We immediately sobered up. I called an ambulance which arrived in 2 minutes. My BF went inside the flat helping the man sit down. There was so much blood I have never seen that in my life. We didn't know what happened to him until we met him yesterday properly for the first time. Recognized my BFS glasses. He was drunk, wanted to ride his bike home, crashed somehow and got a huge cut on his head. He takes heart medicine which thins his blood, that's why he lost so much. If we wouldn't have rung the doorbell, he would have bled to death. He actually gifted us money and a super expensive bottle of champagne for something completely self-explanatory. Story 12. Went down to the local creek with my friend. We were probably 10 or so. The local creepy teenager shows up, drunk out of his mind. I immediately knew this was bad. He mumbles something under his breath, and I looked at my friend with the, "We need to get the fuck out of here" look. He stepped closer towards us, and another guy, older and probably twice the size, ran up and grabbed him. He told us to go home and not come back. Later, the creepy guy was involved in a robbery that turned into murder. And I still feel so thankful to the other guy who was there. Story 13. Tim, older than a good majority of the neighborhood kids and always gave off a creepy vibe, used to try and have his golden retriever attack people. The dog would chase you but never bit anyone. He was very much a loner. We all would avoid him any way we could when we saw him walking around. One day the cops show up at my friend's neighbor's house. Seems there had been a break-in. My friend talked to the girl that lived there. She was in HS and would sometimes babysit my friend and his brother. Turns out all of her dad's guns had been stolen. He had them in a cabinet, but it was more for show than security. So the glass was broken and like 8 rifles and a few handguns were taken. Turned out it was Tim. His mom found them in his bedroom and turned them all over to the police. We never saw Tim again and his mom moved away very shortly afterwards. Story 14. Back in the early 90s, I worked as a night auditor for a small motel in Prospect Heights, Illinois. I was a young mother and worked nights while my husband worked days. Occasionally my husband would stop by and check on me. It was a brutal schedule and I truly don't know how I made it on only a couple hours of sleep each day. But I digress. My job was to perform a daily audit on the rooms and money. Also, I would check people in and out of the hotel. The hours were midnight to 8 in the morning. One night I had finished my audit and was watching a scary movie on the little TV they had behind the front desk. It was winter and very cold. A man came up to the door and he was wearing a ski mask. For a second I thought it was my husband, so I kind of smiled. He came up to the front desk and I asked if I could help him. He asked me why I had smiled at him. Well, I knew right then I was in trouble. He waved a big knife at me and told me to turn around. I felt the most fear then. I felt like I was going to die. He hopped over the front desk and cut one of the phone lines and took the money. I had my coat and purse back there, and he took those as well. As he left, he said, "I have your purse. I know where you live now." I stayed hunched in the corner behind the front desk as he left. Then I realized he had only cut the handset to one phone and the main line on another, so I took the handset from one phone and attached it to another, where he had not cut the main line. I dialed 911 and got an operator on the line. Just as I was about to talk, the guy came back. Apparently he had dropped his knife behind the desk. I saw it on the floor as he came around. I picked it up. In my mind I'm thinking, can I stab him? We stood there kind of facing each other. Me in my uniform and this big guy in a thick ski jacket. He demanded I give him the knife. I truly thought if I tried to stab him I would lose and he would kill me. I gave him the knife. He took the knife and hit me over the head with the handle of the knife a couple of times and then left. The police soon came and I recounted my story. As far as I know, he was never caught. The place I worked for let me have a day off, but when I needed more, I had head injuries, they fired me. It turns out they had been robbed a few times before but had never put in security. I did take them to court for lost wages and I won. About a year later, maybe less, I saw on the news that a night auditor clerk at the same hotel had been kidnapped from the motel, raped, stabbed, and left for dead. They caught that guy, and he is now in prison. I'm literally shaking as I type this. It's been so long, but I rarely talk about this or I just laugh it off like it was no big thing. Obviously, it still affects me greatly. Scariest night of my life. The hotel when I worked there was an Econo Lodge, but they apparently changed the name soon after I left to Forest Lodge. So when the story about the kidnapped clerk came on the news, I didn't immediately realize it was the same motel. Until they showed a photo of the motel. Then I knew, and it scared the crap out of me. Story 15. My house was broken into while we were having dinner. I was about 7 years old at the time. My mom answered the door because she thought it was her friend. Turns out to be robbers in masks with guns. I was pretty small at the time and no one noticed me. I noped out of there and walked straight into my bedroom and locked the door. I think I was in shock at the time and didn't know what to do. In retrospect, I should have dialed 911. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.